So this morning, I am thrilled to meet face to face Anna Cabral, who served as a U.S. Treasurer. And I don't want to steal any of her thunder. I'm going to let her tell her own story. But Anna, thank you for taking some time today and for sharing your story with the Treasury Historical Association. We're excited to feature these little known aspects of our women in leadership at the Treasury. And I think these stories frequently get picked up, while you're in office, and then something else comes up, and now it's time to gather them all together while we have such a group of talented and very influential leaders who've been a part of some pretty historic moments while at Treasury. So maybe you could just begin by telling us, how did you make your way to become U.S. Treasurer?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think there is never a straight path in any part of my life. I would have to say to you that the biggest influence I had in terms of just even getting a career of any sort whatsoever was a high school math teacher who decided that instead of going off to work full time to feed my family, he convinced me to apply to college. Nobody in my family had graduated high school, and the next thing I know, I'm headed off to University of California at Santa Cruz because he went the extra mile, and I never forget that. And he opened doors that I never imagined were possible. Certainly, being Treasurer of the United States never crossed my mind as a child, but I ended up somehow at Harvard doing some graduate work and came down to Washington, D.C. to try to put a public administration degree into practice. Went to work on Capitol Hill, worked for Senator Orrin Hatch, who was a tremendous mentor of mine. And eventually, over the course of my lifetime, he supported me in every step along the way. And with the support of my husband, we were able to finally be considered for the position of treasurer. And I loved the opportunity and ended up joining the Bush administration in the second term. So, like I said, there were a lot of nooks and crannies, twists and turns along the way. But if it weren't for at least those three men, my high school math teacher, my super tremendous mentor in Orrin Hatch, and my husband's support all my life, I don't think I would have made it there.
Terrific, terrific. Was there any one person who sort of tapped in and said, you're in public service, you really ought to be thinking about becoming, taking one of those positions over at Treasury?
The only person was pretty much George W. Bush. I mean, when his administration reached out, it's interesting because it's a political appointment, and I'm not sure how many people realize it's a political appointment. But in the political process, I spent a great deal of time with the Office of Political Appointments, and they ended up offering me a number of different positions over the course of about the first 4 years of his administration. And each time that they did, I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to serve the president well in that position. I'm going to have to turn that down. And somewhere at the end of that period, as I turned down probably 3 or 4 or 5, they basically said, very few people turn us down. And, if you're not careful, you're not going to get another shot at this. And they ended up actually asking me to consider being treasurer. And I actually turned that down a couple of times. And then eventually they called back and said, the president really wants you and needs you. And these are the reasons for it. And I got convinced and I said, okay, I can see that. So I went ahead and pursued the process, which is, as you may know, very lengthy and certainly politically challenging.
Sure. Now, was there a Senate approval required for that?
There was at the time. Yep. There was still a hearing required, Senate approval, Senate vote. And because I had Orrin Hatch, who was then chairman of the Finance Committee, his support, and I knew a number of other senators from having worked on Capitol Hill, getting support in the Senate was not difficult. It was just that it was the end of an election year and no nominees were moving through whatsoever. So no one was getting a hearing, no one was getting on the calendar. But because Orrin Hatch was so well respected, and because I had worked with a number of members, I was able to move to the Senate calendar for a vote, get through a hearing, and be ready. As soon as the election was over, all of the backlog of nominees were immediately approved because there was no point to holding them up.
Right, right. Well, that administration certainly had its challenges. I can imagine that some of that filtered down to your role. Can you tell us how you helped manage some of those challenges and difficulties and surprises?
It certainly was a challenging administration. I mean, you had September 11th right at the beginning, which derailed a lot of the legislative priorities for the president, which, ended up influencing the balance of the time in office. I mean, you had the Iraq War that started and at least had been declared over in 2003, but then all of the follow-up was going on for a number of years. The president himself was interested in trying to do some Social Security reform at the beginning of the administration that I joined, and we spent a lot of time and energy on that, but then suddenly we had the housing crisis, which was enormous. And we spent a lot of time first trying to work with lenders, both subprime and prime, in terms of trying to figure out how we were going to deal with these large numbers of foreclosures that were occurring. And then later, as the administration started to work through what the issues were, we ended up trying to get TARP approved. We did secure a TARP approval, which was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, and then administering that so that we could see and turn the corner and begin to improve the overall health of the economy, because that particular recession was tremendous and impacted families across the country. So spent a lot of time on those issues. In the meantime, spent a lot of time on financial literacy issues, because this administration, or the Bush administration, was heavily supportive of the idea that people should really understand. And in some ways, this housing crisis reminded you that people really needed to understand sort of how this whole process worked. So it was exciting. It was difficult, but I was able to travel all over the country, constantly working on other items that were important to the president's agenda and the secretary's economic agenda, and bring the voices of people back into the decision-making rooms at the Treasury Department, so that they understood what did it really look like on the ground. What did this foreclosure crisis look like?
That must have been really just one of those nonstop crisis management sort of eras in our country. But what does a treasurer do? I remember Hank Paulson. I remember lots and lots of airtime for Hank, and he came out looking pretty good, and all the other little elements that went in. But the treasurer, is that more of kind of a on the ground spokesperson, as you described, or is your staff doing other things that help that policy come together?
So it's a variety of things. So the treasurer, really, the primary focus has been working on anti-counterfeiting and coin production for the country, working with the director of Mint and the director of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And so you're spending a lot of time on those issues, and a good part of my time was spent very much on that. And that's really important, because the US dollar is really a store of value around the world. So you need to make sure it's a very secure instrument. But the other part of it was, we spent a lot of time, again, you're the spokesperson for the most part, for the department, for the president's economic agenda, and for the secretary's agenda as well. And I basically, went out and spoke for, represented the secretary, because Paulson did not really enjoy public speaking very much. He was very good at it, but he didn't enjoy it. So he'd often wrote me into some of his appearances, and then asked me to go out on the road and do that as well. And so I did. We also spent a lot of time on international issues, and again, the focus is coin and currency and changes in the design of the various notes. Because if In fact, a number of countries are dollarized, that is, they use US dollars, then that has to be a concern for us in terms of anti-counterfeiting and educational campaigns to make sure people understand how to determine and if a note is genuine or not, or if it's a counterfeit, et cetera. But then we also did a lot in the area of financial literacy internationally, so that people had a sense. Not only is it a domestic issue, but it's also an international issue. Spent a lot of time on those issues as well. And because of my unique background, having worked on the Hill, when we were working, for example, on TARP, not only did I attend all of the meetings and contribute to the conversations that we were having with the lenders, but also when it came down to securing votes for it, basically a number of us were on the phone calling members of Congress and saying, look, this is the reason we need it, explaining it and getting it approved.
Did you expect that when you were at Harvard?
No, I didn't. It's kind of funny. I don't think I could have told you at all what I was going to end up doing with that degree, but no. But I was hoping I would get a chance to change the world a little bit, and I think in a small way, I may have had a chance to play an important role.
I think you did. So you left Treasury, and then tell us about your life after Treasury.
Certainly. So I went immediately to the Inter-American Development Bank, which does development lending in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it works on issues, it's basically the principle the bank was founded by President Kennedy during his administration, together with a number of other countries in Latin America. And the concept was, a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we are all doing better in the hemisphere, then everybody is benefiting from that. And it's really the programs and initiatives it supports and it lends for are targeting poverty, trying to improve the quality of education, government services, tax reform, energy, healthcare, everything you can imagine that improves quality of life in that region of the world. And so a lot of those issues focus around women and how they're faring and whether they have access to enough small loans to create a small business, to support a family, because they're often the head of household. Do they have access to good health care so that they have healthy children? Do their children have access to education and health care so that they can grow and develop in a very positive and constructive way and become contributing members of society? Do small businesses have the strength and the support and the systems to grow and provide jobs and improve the economy in those countries? So I spent a lot of time in the Inter-American Development Bank. Absolutely loved it. I had actually sort of dabbled a little bit when I was at Treasury, so it was a good fit. It was a place to go and continue to grow along those lines. So what we know is if we invest in women, we really improve the lot of the family. It's not always true if we invest in men. So it was really important to have a focus on women who took and were concerned about the quality of education for their children, or the house that they lived in, or the jobs that they could get, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Oh, fascinating. So here we are describing Women's History Month and the role that Treasury has played in hiring women and elevating women and giving them opportunities. I'll be interested to see how the whole story turns out. But have you been able to pursue other aspects of helping women and girls?
I have had a chance to, not specifically, I don't focus my efforts on just women. I focus my efforts really on people who I think can benefit from a couple of different messages that are key. One of them is the importance of education. Having come from a family where, my mother dropped out of school at the 8th grade, my father at the 9th, education was just not something we had placed a lot of emphasis on. But then having learned, given Mr. Lamb's intervention, that, it really does open all doors. It is the great equalizer. Talking about the importance of education is critical for me. Also talking about financial literacy and helping people understand the basics of managing their finances, absolutely critical. My father could never do that. We never had 2 nickels saved, and I frankly grew up in a very, very poor family. But fortunately, I've learned over time. My husband was a very good money manager and taught me a lot about it and budgeting and so forth. And I want people to understand that that's a critical component. Understanding, how to balance a budget, how to create a budget, what interest rates do, what is compound interest, how does it hurt you, how does it help you, what's a wise investment, what's a depreciating asset, what's an appreciating asset, so forth. Those things I think are important. And then I think just the power that people have to influence and do something good for other people in the world as well as themselves by reaching out and touching other people, as Mr. Lamb did for me. That's important. I continue to chair, for example, the microfinance BBA Bank Foundation, which lends again still in Latin America and the Caribbean, primarily to women. They have a focus on a real priority in helping women be successful in terms of the very issues that the IDB was doing. But this is the private sector with its private foundation doing something very similar in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I do continue that work, and then I continue to do a lot of public speaking in the United States, because there are many young people who don't realize, I think, the importance of those things that I talked about: education, financial literacy, and people in general not realizing, sometimes overwhelmed or just underestimating their own power to have a positive impact on someone else by just taking an extra minute. So those are the things I like to do and I continue to do and will do for the foreseeable future.
Well, we're so fortunate to have people like you who really take to heart this opportunity to change the lives of thousands and millions of people just with some simple concepts like you're describing. And maybe the rest of us who grew up with some of that take it for granted and really underestimate the power that we might have to help other people in a variety of ways, just by supporting these organizations and taking the time to reach out to people one-on-one, like your math teacher. It can make all the difference in the world. We've talked a little bit at the Treasury Historical Association about financial civics, because while we've certainly supportive of all of the efforts of financial literacy, there's a lot of them out there, and with limited sort of resources and scope of a smaller nonprofit, we've tried to carve out something that we're calling financial civics. And so the way we see it is just the depth that comes, from Alexander Hamilton on up, and how the country was structured, how our economic systems were put into place. And you're nodding as if that might ring a bell with you. Have you had a chance to kind of poke around in those areas and maybe tie some of that kind of background knowledge, that fundamental structure, into the financial literacy side of things?
Well, I'm nodding because I think I have a great appreciation for the depth and strength of Alexander Hamilton. I mean, one of the first things I did as I became treasurer was to read the Alexander Hamilton book by Chernow. And after having read it, and it's a doozy, right? It's like 800 pages, but I couldn't put it down. I ended up using it as the foundation for a number of speeches that I would give across the country, because I don't think people really understand how our financial system functions. And there is so much richness in that history. And I think he is an amazing and inspirational person. Someone that a lot of people could relate to, but they think of him as a founding father, somebody so far removed from where they might be. But most people, until now, because we have this great play about Alexander Hamilton that sort of has done a great job of helping people realize a little bit more about who he is. Most people didn't know that he was actually an immigrant from the West Indies, that he was born, he was an illegitimate child of a woman and I think a married man. He was very poor. His mother died when he was young, so he was an orphan when he came to the United States, to the mainland. He self-educated, taught himself a great deal, then went into formal study, then immediately almost became a right-hand person to George Washington, and did amazing things. So people, when we think about the founding fathers, we rarely think about them as being immigrants, even though they may well have come within a generation or two to this new land, looking for basically a new form of government, new opportunities, religious freedom, a number of different reasons that they come. But Alexander Hamilton, oddly enough, was just an amazingly brilliant man. And as he worked with George Washington to win the war for independence, he was always thinking very quickly about what kind of new government are we going to establish? How do we change our dynamic? What do we do to ensure that we have strong financial systems in place so that we have the ability as a new nation to interact with the rest of the world and be successful? So, I mean, he basically created everything that we take for granted and he laid the seeds for everything from the Coast Guard to, the financial systems that we count on today to the tax systems, everything you can imagine. He had an opinion on it. He wrote about it. And many of his ideas were put in place, and many came to be even later after he died. So I think it's phenomenal. I think it's really a wonderful niche for the Historical Society to be focused on, because I think people don't really understand enough about what our forefathers really imagined. And I think in this time when we're looking back and we're trying to judge them from a lens that is, today's, it's probably not a fair thing to do, but we haven't begun to understand the brilliance that these men had to put in place systems from the design of our government, the three branches, to our Treasury Department. And so I love what you're doing. I spend a lot of time talking with young people about Alexander Hamilton's example specifically because I think it's inspirational.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, he really did. He was a self-made person who just happened to have a little dash of genius that helped him along. Super. Well, is there one day, like a memorable day? We talked a lot about 9/11 and all that fallout and the financial crisis, the housing crisis. But is there another day that really stands out in your memory, back to being treasurer, that might have been funny, that maybe we wouldn't have heard, maybe didn't make any headlines?
Well, I can think of a day that was personally important to me, and you wouldn't have heard about it. And that was the day that, as Treasurer of the United States, you get your name on the currency. And in order to do that, they ask you to, write it on a piece of paper, and then they create a metal plate, which they use in the drums to make money. And I remember the first time I went over to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to meet all of the staff, the senior ranks. I thought it was just a meet and greet. Nobody warned me that they were going to be trying to collect my signature for the purpose of putting it on the money. And it's a little scary moment. But I remember sitting there at the table, and they said, "Oh, by the way, can we just get you to sign this piece of paper? We're going to use this signature." And I thought, "Okay, well, sure." So I tried to put pen to paper, and my hand was just literally shaking. I couldn't get it to stop. And there's all these people, assembled watching to see if, and I repeatedly attempt to put the pen on the paper, and I can't do it. And after several attempts, I said, "Oh my gosh, they're going to think I'm absolutely an idiot or something because I can't manage to write." And I said, "So I'm going to have to put this in perspective." So I stopped for a second, took a deep breath, and then I realized that this was a moment where I was going to be able to memorialize the sacrifices that my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my parents made so that their offspring, one of their offspring, could go out into the world and be successful. And this would be the moment where, just their name on a piece of paper, their last names, as well as my husband's last name and his family, because we're both Mexican American and come from, a long line. I was a third generation farm worker family, and his family had also worked in the fields early in life. Both of us had grown up. He was a little bit more middle class. I was definitely low income and had been, and everyone in my family had been very poor. So this was a moment where I got to say, look, everything that you did, all these things that you suffered through, now you're saying to the world that, it counted, that it mattered, that somehow that contribution turned into something great. And then I didn't have any trouble writing. The pen went down to the piece of paper, and it was fantastic.
Oh, what a wonderful story. And I hope you don't mind if we share this with the world, because it really crystallizes just generations of all those gifts that came down to you. And then once you were grounded in that, you were like, all right, here I am. I'm stepping up. Is there anything else you'd like to reminisce about or
I will say this. I love what you're doing in terms of telling the stories of women at the Treasury Department. And I think we had our first female treasurer like in 1953, if I'm not wrong. Um, we might have to look up that date. But so it's been interesting. There have been women treasurers ever since. But there are two things that I noticed when I went to Treasury the first day. One was the phenomenal caliber of talent that exists in those halls. And this is the civil servant talent, right? People who run the building, who are there every single day, make sure the systems work, live up to Alexander Hamilton's expectations every single day. Talented, bright, capable. And there's a good mix of men and women, although largely men. But at the senior levels, the day I walked in, there were absolutely no women. And that was very surprising to me. So interesting, surprising, a little bit challenging. The financial industry is not one where women are heavily represented, but I think you're seeing progress. And now, we've seen the highest positions at Treasury filled with women. The other thing that I thought was interesting, and here's a challenge for you in some ways, is that there is a wonderful hallway. It will change now, but of all of the portraits of the former treasurers, I'm sorry, former secretaries of the department. And as you can imagine, it's man after man after man after man after man. But this is the sort of the grand view of the department. And I was thinking, that's interesting that, there's such a hole in it with regard to the women who have served. And so at one point, I even thought about starting a program where we would start developing portraits of the treasurers so we could get some women on the walls. Still something we could do. But it's beautiful what you're doing in terms of telling the story of women who've been able to contribute to the work of that department and the grand work of this nation and our economic system. So thank you for what you're doing.